Hey peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the Vogue 8997 sew along, and today we're going to be making the skirt and the skirt lining. So let's get started. I'm going to start sewing my dress from the skirt first, so I'm going to sew the skirt outer and the skirt lining. There isn't actually a lot of bias on the bottom of these skirt pieces, but I would like to err on the side of caution and get this made, hung up, and let any bias that there is drop before I start working on the bodice. So the first thing that we need to do is stitch skirt front sections together at centre front, and I am going to sew all of mine with French seams. This is a fully lined dress, so I have in the past sewn these together at 5/8 of an inch and pinked the edges of my fabric, but I am using a viscose and a viscose acetate lining which do fray, so I am going to French seam everything, so it's going to take a little bit longer, but it will be a nice finish. I'm going to sew the skirt front sections together at the centre front, then we're going to sew the side front pieces to those, we're going to sew the side back pieces to the side front pieces, and then we're going to sew on the back pieces. Basically completely different order to the way that the pattern would like you to do it. I have labelled all of my pieces because I needed to take the pattern pieces off to cut out the lining, so I have labelled all of my pattern pieces and put in my notches, so I'm going to match those all up, sew everything together at 1/4 of an inch to start with, then we can trim the seam, press it and sew it at 3/8 of an inch, and of course I'll show you as we go. Okay, so I have sewn all of the skirt seams together on the lining and on the main outer fabric. I have sewn them at 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides together, and I'm now going to trim all of those seam allowances down so that they are about 1/8 of an inch, so that I can press them right sides together and finish off the French seams. So there's 8 panels in each section of the skirt, so I have a lot of seams to trim. I'm going to get all of that done. I have left the back seam open. I'm going to finish that edge with bias binding. The lining of the skirt and the outer of the skirt have been finished. I still need to press the seams, but everything has been French seamed. As you know, that's my preference. So I'm going to hang these up, and if there is any bias in the hems, they let that drop, and then we can move on to the bodice. Now that we have finished the skirt, we can start on the bodice. The first thing it wants you to do is interface each section of the bodice. Now, as I mentioned, I don't particularly like this finish. I am actually going to flatline mine with cotton lawn, so I need to take all of these pieces off and lay them out and find out which ones I want to be the lining, because I've cut my lining from my outer fashion fabric as well. So I'm going to find out which pieces I want to be my lining, which pieces I want to be my outer, and then I am going to flatline them with the cotton lawn that I have also cut out. Before I take these off of the pattern pieces, I am going to mark in all the notches and any relevant match points that there are on the pattern pieces. So just cut in the notches here. I'm not going to worry about this small circle because this is what helps us get the sleeves in, and I'm not putting any sleeves in this dress, but if I was, this would be something that I would match. And same down here, there's a small circle here for the zip. So I'm going to put those in and then get everything flatlined. I have my outer layer of fashion fabric, and then I have pinned to that my cotton lawn that I have cut out in the same shape as well, and I've pinned that while everything was flat. Trust me, the pins are kind of making it look bubbly, but it's not too bad. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this edge, then I'm going to sew this edge, then I'm going to sew that edge, and then I'm going to sew this edge. I don't want to just go all the way around because that can distort things, so I like to kind of do the opposite edges as I sew to make sure that everything lies as flatly as possible. And I've got my lining pieces over there, and I've marked those with a pin to make sure that I know that they're lining, and as soon as this is sewn on, then I'll know this is the outer fabric. But like I say, I'm going to sew this edge, then this edge, then the shoulder seam, then the waist seam, then the neckline, then the armhole, and hopefully that way I will have a nicely flat lined piece. I'm going to do that for both sides. Then I'm going to put these to the side and get the bodice side back and do that, and then I can sew those two together, and then I will be able to then move on to the front pieces. I have flatlined my back bodice pieces. Now I'm going to do the same with the side back bodice pieces, so that I can then sew these together and then I can move on to the front. I have flatlined the bodice back and the bodice side back, so I am going to do step number 4, stitch bodice back to bodice side back along the princess seam, and then we're going to press that seam towards the side, and I'm going to do that for the outer fabric and the lining. Okay, so I thought I'd show you how I pin this together. So the first thing that I do is I match up the notches, and I'm actually going to pin it so that I have the back bodice on top and the side back bodice underneath, and that's because the back bodice is going to have more curves and ripples in it, and we want to sew it with the back bodice on top so that we can control the fullness to make sure that we don't get any tucks or puckers in our seams. So I've pinned the notch in first, then I've gone up to the underarm seam here and I have pinned that into place, and then I'm just going to pin this one into place. You may need to clip into the curves depending on your fabric. I have found that I didn't need to with mine. The next thing that I'm going to do is match up the waist seam here and pin that into place, and then I am just going to make sure that I'm smoothing everything out and pinning all the way along the rest of that seam. And you want to bear in mind, if you are having any issues with things bubbling, what you want to be matching is the 5/8 of an inch, not necessarily the raw edge. So as I say, you may need to clip into the curves. This curve is actually quite mild, so we don't really need to do that for this one, but for the front princess seam there is quite a considerable curve there, so we may need to clip into that one. So that's everything nicely pinned in place, but do you see what I mean? There is lots of fullness on this back piece, and on the side bodice it's lying nice and flatly. So we want to sew with the back bodice facing up so that we can see all this fullness and make sure that we're easing or just smoothing it out as we sew so that we don't get any tucks or puckers. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to do this for both sides and the lining. Okay, I haven't pressed them yet, but I have 2 back panels sewn together, and the same with the lining. So I'm going to repeat all of those steps with the front panels. So I'm going to flatline the front panel and the side front panel, then I'm going to sew them together. I have got the center front sewn to the side front, and as you can see, I'm going to need to notch this curve to make everything lie flatly, and I'm going to do that with my pinking shears all the way around. That'll help the edges to not fray, and also it will help notch the curves, and then I can press everything. I've done that for the lining pieces as well. But before I go and press, I am going to sew the center front and the shoulder seams together. It's step number 1, stitch bodice front sections together at center front between large circles. So there's a circle at the top of the pattern piece, and then there's a circle at the bottom of the pattern piece, and they're 5/8 of an inch away, so they're the match points. So I'm going to sew from there to there, and that will just mean that when we come to attach it to the skirt portion and the bodice to the lining, we'll be able to do it nicely at these points. So I'm going to mark the points in and then sew 5/8 of an inch down the center front between those 2 large circles. Then I'm going to sew the shoulder seams together, which is very different to the way that they would like you to do it, but I prefer to finish my bodices this way. So if you'd like to follow along with me, sew your shoulder seams together now. I have sewn the shoulder seams together and the front seams together, so I'm now going to go and press everything. So I want to press the front seams open, the shoulder seams open, and then these curved seams will be pressed towards the side, and I'm going to do that for the bodice, outer and the lining. I am lining and finishing my bodice very differently from the pattern, so I won't be referring back to the pattern from now on because I'm not going to be following it. I have the neckline of my lining pinned to the neckline of my outer bodice, and I'm going to sew around that at 5/8 of an inch, pivoting at this center point. I am going to leave an inch of the back edge unsewn so that I can put my zipper in later, then finish that neck edge and then finish the interior of the zipper cleanly. So I'm going to sew from an inch in all the way around the neckline, pivoting at the center front and all the way around here, again leaving an inch there unsewn, so I'm back stitching at the end and at the start to finish off my bodice. Once I've sewn the bodice to the lining, I am now under stitching, so I have all of the seam allowance towards the lining and I am stitching a couple of millimeters or 1/8 of an inch into the lining side, attaching all of the seam allowance to the lining, which will help to make the lining stay inside of the dress and also help us press this later. I haven't trimmed or clipped anything yet. I'm going to do the understitching first, then I'm going to trim and clip into any curves to help everything lie nice and smoothly. I'm going to do this all the way around the lining. However, when I started, I've left an inch free for putting the zip in later, and my understitching is started another inch away from that so that this is all easily accessible later. We will finish the understitching off once the zipper is put in. And I'm going to do like that. As I say, I'm going to do that for both sides. Once I get to the center, I'm going to back stitch and stop, break my stitching and start again, because it's a very sharp pivot and I won't be able to continuously stitch all the way around. I have trimmed the seam allowance around the neckline and I have now pinned the armholes to the lining all the way around on both sides, and I'm going to sew those at 5/8 of an inch. Then I can turn it through and press it. I've sewn the armholes together, then I've used my pinking shears to trim the seam allowance back and to notch the curves. So the next thing I'm going to do is reach inside through the shoulder strap and I'm going to pull the back bodice through to the front. Now this will be tight because it is quite a narrow shoulder strap, but it is totally doable. So I'm going to do that for both sides and then I'll take it to the ironing board so that I can press everything and then we can sew up the side seams. I have pressed everything. I have pressed with the wrong side up so that the understitching can do its job to help the lining to roll to the inside. So the next thing we're going to do is close up the side seams. So we're going to take one of our armholes and we are going to match up the underarm seam. And we are going to nest the seam allowance, which means we'll have one seam allowance going one way and the other seam allowance going the other way. And that will help us get a nice join. So I'm going to pin that into place and then I'm going to pin from the waist seam of the lining right through to the waist seam of the outer bodice. I'm going to pin those together and we'll sew those together at 5/8 of an inch, and we're going to do the same for both sides. So once you've sewn the side seams, you want to press them open and then give the underarm area a press to make it lie nice and flatly, and we have a finished bodice. As ever, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!